It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV. But where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? Lucky there's a Family Guy, and he's coming up next.
That clip will never get old. You'd be hard-pressed to find a television series that affected the medium of animation quite like Family Guy, for better or worse. The series, which chronicles the misadventures of the dysfunctional Griffin family, has seen many detractors over its 24 years on and off the air. First being called a Simpsons ripoff simply because everything back then was a Simpsons ripoff. However, today most people point to Family Guy as the reason adult animation has been so held back, with the medium's focus on derivative sitcoms with simplistic art styles, limited animation, and an over-reliance on pop culture references or shock humour in place of well-written dialogue, all being attributed to Seth MacFarlane's cash cow. A generalisation that loses more validity with each passing year. Despite this though, the show has endured, now in its 21st season, and surviving 2 cancellations along with multiple lawsuits. Family Guy has become a multi-billion-dollar franchise that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Which means we can all look forward to people continuing to point to the series as a herald for the collapse of society for a long time to come. Though, it wasn't always like this. A lot of people who talk about Family Guy today see the entire series as a single entity, that it has always been bad, and that just isn't true. Because the series we see today is merely a shadow of what it once was. Somewhere along the way, it transformed from a clumsy but well-meaning show with smart character-driven dialogue into a tangled mess of a cartoon that does everything it can to be as cruel and offensive as possible in a desperate bid to remain relevant, to a point where one must ask, where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? I have lost control of my life. Hiya folks, welcome to the show, where today we're going to be taking a look beyond the quote-unquote funny moments as we explore the early years of Family Guy and, more importantly, how it essentially traded its soul to be resurrected from the dead. And now that's quite a loaded topic, so let's jump right in with a brief-ish history of Family Guy's development. Let's try and speedrun this section, since I imagine most people are already well aware of how Family Guy came to be. In 1995, student of the Rhode Island School of Design, Seth MacFarlane created an animated short film entitled The Life of Larry, which contained a lot of the DNA that would later create the foundation for Family Guy, down to jokes that would later be recycled for the show's first season, word for word. It so happened his professor sent his short to Hanna-Barbera, who hired him to develop another short for their What a Cartoon anthology series. Seth would adapt his previous film into Larry and Steve, a much more family-friendly take on the characters, focusing on Larry and his wisecracking talking dog as they go on a misadventure to a department store where slapstick ensues. While very different from its predecessor, this second take still does provide some interesting foreshadowing.
Oh, let's see now, where to shop? Well, Stewie's has usually got good stuff.
While Larry and Steve would not be picked up for a full series, Seth landed a gig as a staff writer on one of the shows that did, Johnny Bravo, working on the show's first season. This was when executives at Fox saw both his previous shorts and requested Seth develop the concepts into a full series, requesting a 15-minute pilot and giving him a budget of $50,000. The now mostly lost pilot was a success, and Fox greenlit Family Guy for a 7-episode first season, and the rest is history, that we will cover later in the video. The original run of Family Guy lasted 3 seasons from January 1999 to February of 2002, and is a far cry from what we know the show to be today. So let's take a look back at those early years and see where the show began and what changed. The premiere episode, Death Has a Shadow, introduces the main characters as Peter deals with losing his job after being hungover from a staff party the night before. Due to a mistake on part of the welfare office, the family becomes rich and Peter begins spoiling his wife and kids. Meanwhile, the evil baby genius Stewie commits several failed murder attempts against his mother Lois when she confiscates his mind control device. When the lies catch up with the family and Peter is taken to court, Stewie realizes that despite his hatred of his parents, he is entirely dependent on them and thus uses the device to stop Peter from being sent to prison and get him his job back. For the first 4 episodes, they had this idea of each title being in the style of old radio crime dramas. So after Death Has a Shadow, there was I've Never Met a Dead Man, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, and Mind Over Murder. A cute idea, but I can see why they quickly dropped it and went with more standard episode titles that are actually related to the story. I mean, could you imagine if they kept doing that all the way up till today? From here, we're going to take a look at each Griffin family member individually and discuss how they were portrayed in the show's early days, for the time being mostly ignoring what they eventually become. And of course, who better to start with than...
P... Tier... Griffin.
If I had to sum up the Griffin patriarch in a word, it would be careless. Peter has no filter and will always speak his mind despite how inappropriate or offensive his thoughts are, which often lands him in trouble with his family or at his work. His immaturity and difficulty understanding how others feel likely stems from his tumultuous childhood. Growing up in a strict Catholic home where he was neglected by his parents, which stunted his emotional and mental development. Peter is also incredibly impulsive, jumping into crazy schemes without hesitation if he thinks it will benefit him in some way, which often involves his kids. He does love his family but has difficulty expressing that in healthy, non-self-destructive ways, and can often lose sight of what's important but nearly always comes around by the end. And once he finally understands he's done something wrong, he will do anything and everything to try and make it right. Such as in the season 2 episode, Let's Go on the Hop, where Peter goes undercover as a new student at Meg's school to try and stop the spread of a new drug. But when he gets caught in the lie, wanting to get a second chance at his teenage years, he ends up hurting Meg when he chooses to take the popular girl to the dance over her. But in the end, he makes the right decision and helps Meg become one of the most popular girls in school, even if only for a brief moment. A lot of Peter episodes focus on his vices, be it his addiction to television or his alcoholism.
This comic sucks. He couldn't make me laugh even if I was laughing my ass off and he was making me do it, huh? Come on, Skinny, make me laugh.
Peter, that's a microphone stand.
The second episode of season 1, I Never Met a Dead Man, is a prime example of this. When Peter accidentally takes out television for the town, he is given a new lease on life and begins spending copious amounts of time with his family, inevitably driving them crazy until the status quo resets. Perhaps my favourite episode of the first 3 seasons, Death Lives, follows Peter undergoing a near-death experience while he's out golfing on his and Lois's anniversary. Death takes him on a tour of his past when Peter and Lois first fell in love, allowing Peter to understand how much he has taken her for granted lately and that he has to pay more attention to her. Speaking of Lois, let's discuss her next because I find her to be the backbone of the show, who fights against this idea of the sad stay-at-home housewife that we often see in media like this, because Lois is not defined by her role in the family and has a fulfilling and eventful life outside her kitchen. Whether it's stepping up to be the lead artistic director of a theatre company or running for president of the school board, she is the most strong-willed, compassionate and driven character of the series. She doesn't let anyone push her around and will always be the first to call Peter out for whatever ridiculous stunt he pulls, but also motivate him to do the right thing in the end. Despite Lois essentially acting as a foil to Peter, the show still demonstrates why the two fell in love and still remain together. She is charmed by his zest for life and finds his lack of social decorum endearing. Lois comes from a wealthy background and is from a world she never really felt she belonged in, and Peter helped her escape that. They have a myriad of issues with communication, but they are willing to work on it and their love for each other always wins out. Though Lois isn't exactly a saint herself, and despite often preaching about what the right thing to do is, she will often have her personal judgment clouded. Such as in Wasted Talent, where she learns Peter is a prodigy at playing the piano, but only when he's drunk. Desperate to win in a competition against her piano teaching rival, she keeps Peter in his inebriated state despite her fully understanding how wrong it is. She's a devoted and protective mother who'll do anything for her kids, which also leads to her flying off the handle sometimes, such as plotting revenge against a group of teens who humiliated Meg. But these moments also make Lois such an interesting character, with the implications about how crazy her past was, with this idea that nothing really phases her anymore.
Now, Meg, if you're gonna grab a hold of life, you've gotta expect to get your hands dirty once in a while.
It was kind of cool that people noticed me.
That's the spirit, honey. Okay, 1, 2, 3, tuck and roll.
Of course, the show's breakout star was Stuart Gilligan Griffin, a smart alecky toddler with an eye for mischief and world domination, but first he has to take care of his smothering mother whom he views as an oppressive nuisance out to foil his plans. When in reality, most of the family lacks any idea what their youngest is up to, with Brian being the only one able to understand him. Well, sort of. The show kind of goes back and forth where sometimes anything Stewie says falls on deaf ears, but occasionally other family members will respond in such a way where it's clear they did in fact hear him.
Victory is mine!
Yes, and this cake is yours too.
What I find interesting is that Stewie being evil is not really a huge part of his character. I expected going back this early into the series to see nothing but him hating his family members, but no, there are plenty of moments where they get along. Stewie's attempts to kill Lois are really more of a running gag than one of the core aspects of his character, as it's not something that happens as often as I remember. Almost as though the writers quickly realised that his gimmick of being a diabolical infant wasn't really sustainable. And yes, while he still does a lot of bad things, a lot of the humour focuses on his constant misunderstandings of the world in spite of his vast intelligence. Things like how he doesn't know what a doctor is, simply calling them the man in white, or doesn't know the house phone number so he starts dialing every combination. And I think the contrast of this well-spoken and very intelligent baby who is constantly baffled by such basic human concepts is far more entertaining than just watching him fail to off his mother. The other thing of note with Stewie is the way the show explores his sexuality, but I don't see it as just making gay jokes. It's a legitimate aspect of his character that shouldn't be ignored. Because Stewie is entirely comfortable with that part of himself, or even just the idea of not knowing who he's going to turn out to be and feeling free to explore that.
And then I think to myself, my God, wouldn't it be marvellous if I turned out to be a homosexual?
There is often this idea that Meg was always the most disposable of the family members, that there wasn't much to her down to her being recast after season 1. Well, I am here to argue the opposite, because in revisiting the first few seasons, I found Meg to be one of the most well-rounded and dynamic characters on the show, debatedly having a more prominent role than Brian, which is why I'm discussing her first. On the surface, she does come across as a whiny teenager complaining about how embarrassing her family is at every turn. And while, yes, she does fill in that role of being the typical teen with stories about high school and popularity and all that stuff, there's a lot more to Meg that a lot of people don't really notice. Like the rest of her family, she has a strong determination, but she stands out in her resourcefulness. Like when she became the first member of the press to score an interview with Mayor Adam West. But something about Meg that isn't appreciated is how talented she is. Despite there being an entire musical number about how she's useless, multiple times we see her try and do something new and really excel at it. When she becomes a flag girl for her high school after being rejected from the cheerleaders, she gives it her all and turns out to be really good. A lot of Meg's stories see her trying new things, which adds a lot of variety that the other characters don't really provide. The other thing with Meg that would later come to define her is her treatment by the rest of the family. But going back to these early episodes, a lot of that isn't really here. Lois is very caring and attentive to her, like a mother should be, and it is clear Peter loves his daughter but doesn't know how to communicate those feelings, which is again his main character flaw that is explored with the entire family. I'd argue in this era, Peter treats Lois far worse than he does Meg.
Sorry, Meg. Daddy loves you, but Daddy also loves Star Trek. And in all fairness, Star Trek was here first.
If anything, it's Stewie and Brian who are the most outwardly cruel to her.
I can't believe you put your family before your own daughter!
She's a whiny little runt, isn't she? I said runt.
Meg had a few B-plots early on, but the season 2 episode 15 Minutes of Shame is one of my favourites. Meg brings her family on a talk show to expose how embarrassing they are, only for it to result in the Griffins being given their own reality series. But when Meg tries to quit, she is replaced by an actress who quickly takes over the show. This is such a fun episode, especially nowadays with how big this kind of content has become, exposing just how fake and exploitative the whole thing is. But it has such a nice ending where the rest of the family quits the show to get Meg back, meaning they all get replaced and have to live in a crappy motel for 6 months until the contract finishes.
Hey, Lois, there's a Bible in here. Hey, look at me. I'm a Christian. I'm reading the Bible.
Maybe I'm giving her early appearances too much credit because of hindsight, but I really do find Meg to be one of the most interesting and relatable characters in this era of the show. Brian is the outspoken, dry-witted, and most of the time, responsible family dog with a passion for arts that also makes him very egotistical and stuck up. He is Peter's most loyal friend and also his harshest critic, always standing by his side even when he knows full well Peter is in the wrong. For the first 3 seasons, Peter and Brian are the show's main comedic duo, which makes sense, as it's the time-tested trope of the smart guy reacting to the dumb guy.
Brian, there's a message in my alphabet. It says, ooh.
Peter, those are Cheerios.
In fact, despite how popular they would become, these early years rarely decide to pair up Brian and Stewie until the final episodes of season 3. They have snarky interactions here and there, but aside from the Road 2 episodes, their dynamic isn't really all that explored, mainly because Brian, as mentioned, is a very Peter-focused character, though he does have a few spotlight episodes and even the closest we get to an ongoing character arc, with him starting therapy early in season 2 and continuing to go to sessions throughout the rest of the series. Despite Brian overall not having as large a presence in the show as one might expect, he was still the focus of a lot of tentpole episodes of the series. The season 1 finale, Brian Portrait of a Dog, sees him deal with being treated as a second-class citizen and really explores who Brian is by delving into his past. Then the 2-part season 3 premiere sees him going through a midlife crisis where he becomes addicted to drugs and eventually leaves home to pursue a life in Hollywood before realizing how much he misses his family and returning home. But when people think of an episode about Brian, their mind always goes to season 3 episode 17, Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows, one of the series' most famous episodes that won an Emmy Award for its song. In the episode, Brian is feeling depressed with his flatlining love life. When a night out results in a DUI, he has to spend time with an elderly woman who hasn't left her house in 30 years. The woman named Pearl is cruel and very demanding of Brian, threatening to call the judge and send him to jail if he refuses anything she asks. After snapping at her and telling her to drop dead, Brian learns that she was once a famous jingle singer who was shunned when she tried to become a full music artist despite her angelic voice, which is why she became secluded. Brian returns, and after stopping her suicide attempt, the two begin to connect as they both feel they have finally found someone who understands them. Through the aforementioned Emmy Award-winning tune, Brian catches her up on the last 30 years and convinces her to leave the house, only for tragedy to strike. While Pearl is on her deathbed, Brian uses some virtual reality headsets that were introduced in Act 1 to allow the pair to spend many more years together in the span of a few moments. It's one of the most heartbreaking sequences ever put to screen, and it's from freaking Family Guy. Now, Chris is kind of an interesting case because at the start of the series, the writers kind of forgot to give him a personality. He's there to be a dumb and immature 13-year-old, and that's all he brings to the table. It's not until the end of season 1 where we are finally given something to work with in the episode The Sun Also Draws, which I find to be a hilarious title, as though the writers are admitting they neglected to give Chris any distinguishing traits. For a lot of the show, Chris's role is to just be there, make a scene feel less empty, say a few lines, get a good joke in every now and then, and that's it. But whenever they decide to give him his own storyline, he really does shine and provides some of the most heartfelt moments of the show. His main traits are being a talented young artist and wanting to have a good relationship with his father, both of which is at the forefront of the season 2 episode A Picture is Worth 1,000 Bucks, where Chris is scouted by a famous art collector who brings him to New York to mold him into a star, and Chris goes along with it because Peter wants their name to be famous and Chris wants to make his father proud. But when he's told he can no longer see his family because they might ruin his image, he decides to give up this opportunity. Another fantastic Peter and Chris episode is the season 2 finale Forefather, where upon having his parenting criticised by his friends, Peter gets Chris a job at the local golf course, which he excels at. However, Peter becomes distracted when he starts training Cleveland Jr. to become a golfing champion. It ends with this really nice quiet moment between Peter and Chris where they don't say anything. Now we're going to talk about the show's writing, comedy, music, visuals, all that good stuff. The writing of the show is so fast-paced, it's constantly throwing jokes at you, so even when one doesn't land, you hardly notice because there's another great line a few seconds later. The show is also brilliant when it comes to setup and payoff, where a joke from earlier in the episode reappears with an added twist. I was laughing out loud multiple times, even from the very first episode.
Stewie, why don't you play in the other room?
Why don't you burn in hell?
Well, no dessert for you, young man.
I think one of the show's big strengths and what gives it so much charm is how down-to-earth the family are despite the chaos that surrounds them. A lot of the humour from these early years comes from how casual and nonchalant the family reacts to all the wacky stuff that they witness. It telegraphs this as a world where anything can happen while still keeping it somewhat grounded, but it also knows it's a cartoon and isn't ashamed of that. There's a surrealism to the world the Griffins inhabit and such a spontaneity where you never know what style of comedy or reference they'll go for next. This also allows them to have a good balance between smart writing and just really stupid dialogue that still gets a laugh.
You've got 3 days to earn a badge.
3 days? That's tomorrow. We gotta get going.
Most violence happens off-screen, which is way funnier, and even when it is visible, there's never any excessive visuals. Instead, sometimes characters just explode. The only real exceptions is when said violence is an essential part of the story, and even then, there's never anything that graphic. The characters' personalities all contrast against each other beautifully, and it leads to so many memorable interactions. And they do well at mixing up the dynamics often to make sure everyone has their moments, whether they be mean-spirited or genuinely heartfelt and tender, which happens more frequently than one might expect. Then we have what really sets Family Guy apart from other shows around this time, the music. The show encompasses such a wide variety of musical styles with this big band sound, and it's all just fantastic and adds so much charm and polish to the series. So many of the people who made this show had an extensive background in music, and it shows throughout.
I thought you wanted to do a good show. Well, if you want to do a bad show, why don't we just do Rent?
From the very specific references to classical pieces and the inclusion of licensed stuff to the show's numerous fantastic original songs. Even when it was a simple parody, they would still put everything they had into it, from the vocals to the animation. Road to Rhode Island, I'm Gonna Make You Famous, Gotta Give Up the Toad. It's time we give the show's discography its dues. Perhaps the biggest and most prevalent criticism of Family Guy is its limited visuals, with the animation often being called cheap and lazy. Now, saying that about any animation production is wrong, because even the worst thing you've ever seen still took a lot of time and effort, but for its original run, Family Guy was a visually pleasing and ambitious show, especially during the action scenes. Yes, its character designs are simple and a bit crude, but like the rest of the show, there is something inescapably charming about them. There's a less is more approach that falls in line with shows like The Simpsons. Throughout the original run, Fox would constantly move the show to different time slots where it would be competing against some of the highest rated shows on network television at that time, such as Frasier, Survivor, and Friends. It was due to the lack of a consistent schedule that the ratings plummeted. Fox originally intended to cancel the series after season 2, but at the last minute picked up the show for an additional 13 episodes, which became the back half of season 3. Family Guy ran for a few years, with season 3 ending in 2002, giving the show a total of 49 aired episodes and 1 unaired episode that would later premiere as part of Cartoon Network's late-night mature animation block Adult Swim. It was there the show would be given a second chance to find its audience. It quickly became the block's most viewed program, which led to a massive increase in DVD sales, selling 2.2 million copies by the end of 2003, making it one of the highest selling DVDs of that year, as well as one of the most profitable TV DVDs ever. If any of that sounds familiar, that's because the exact same thing happened with another Fox animated series, Futurama, but that's a topic for another time. Now, there is a slight detour I want to take around this point, because it's easy to say that after 2002, nothing really happened until the show was brought back, but that's not entirely true, as there is actually another piece of Family Guy media that slightly predates season 4. I'm talking about the 2005 soundtrack Family Guy Live in Vegas. I've always been fascinated by tie-in TV show albums that contain original songs not connected to any specific episode. In fact, one of my favourite pieces of SpongeBob media is the Best Day Ever album, which plays out kind of like a Bikini Bottom radio broadcast with DJ interludes and sponsorship ads. The main reason I love these sort of soundtracks is because for long-running shows, these become almost like a time capsule, a snapshot of how the characters were presented during that era of the series. Because these songs are not from episodes, instead being meant to be musical pieces written and performed by the characters in-universe, they give you this direct look into how the writers saw the characters at that time. And the reason I brought up The Best Day Ever is because that album and Live from Vegas are actually quite similar, both being released in the mid-2000s when their respective series had been revived shortly after finishing its original run. So here's the case. I randomly found this last year at a used electronics store, so it's seen better days. On the front we can sort of see the entire family on stage. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this case up close is because of something hidden away. If we open it up, we find the disc and song booklet, standard for CDs at this time, but this also features a bonus DVD which has some behind the scenes stuff, but it's not the DVD I'm interested in. Because if we open the secret compartment where the DVD is located, we find these profiles of the Griffins from season 1. And I just want us to really look at these for a moment. The odd proportions, the wonkiness of the line work, focus on those imperfections and how they give these simple images so much life and personality. Anyway, the album opens with fanfare and intro, which is exactly what it says. The show's reoccurring news anchors Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons introduce the show and have some banter before heading into a full version of the theme song. And I am immediately thrown off by how high-pitched Alex Bornstein sounds as Lois, almost as if she couldn't quite remember how to do the voice. I mean, just compare this clip of Lois singing in season 1 to this.
You'll never know if you don't know now.
It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV.
It's a good song, but the only really thing of note is the lore drop that Peter is the one who bought Meg her hat. The next track is Babysitting's a Bum Deal, a number between Stewie and Haley Duff, which sees them going back and forth giving each other compliments, while an echo says what they really mean. A fun time, but nothing to really write home about. Then Brian has a song called Dear Booze, which is about how he uses alcohol to cope with his depression, which was something that was brought up in the first 3 seasons. But let's just ignore how broken of a person Brian is and listen to those otherworldly vocals.
Mm.
Next, Quagmire enters with Patti LuPone as she discusses their previous relationship and how she found him cheating on her. Quagmire canonically fucked Yellow Diamond. The song is called The Q-Man Loves Nobody, which is really just about what a scumbag he is. Then the family comes back to the stage as Lois scolds Chris for using inappropriate language, which was a running gag on the show.
I think I saw one of her nipples.
Chris, that's a terrible word. Nipple.
The next song is a fun one. It's called All Cartoons Are Fucking Dicks and is about the family exposing Hanna-Barbera and other cartoon characters for being awful people off the set. Brian gets another solo outing, but this one is interesting because it's the only song in here that's actually based on an episode. That being the late season 3 outing, Road to Europe. It's called The Last Time I Saw Paris, an autobiographical song about Brian describing a short-lived romance he had while in Paris. We finally get something good with track 8, But Then I Met You, a comedic salsa duet between Peter and Lois about how they changed each other's lives that re-establishes everything I previously talked about. Like how Peter was Lois's escape from her suffocating life of wealth and expectations, and how she finds his lack of social decorum endearing. Brian introduces the next song, which is a medley of TV show themes from the 80s, which is one of Family Guy's favourite things to reference. With this being a Brian and Stewie duet, there is of course a lot of banter and playful mockery, but I really think it serves to highlight how by the end of the original series and going into the new run of episodes, these two are now the show's favourite comedic pairing. Chris gets his very own solo called Puberty's Gonna Get Me, which is about, well, I think you can guess. Peter and Lois get another much slower and more romantic duet called I'm Yours, which is about how Lois loves Peter despite all his flaws, that shows a surprising amount of self-awareness from Peter.
You may be dopey, or maybe messy, or maybe Peter, and I'm yours.
Next, Brian sings a song called Slightly Out of Tune, which is an English adaptation of Desafinado. It's a stunning piece that serves to highlight how cultured Brian is. Then after it's done, he asks Lois if they can make out. Keep that in the back of your mind, we'll address it later. Herbert sings a song called One Boy, and we're gonna skip this one. The true finale of the album is the song Quahog Holiday, which is about the entire cast singing about what they love most about their hometown, including Mayor Adam West. Which, aside from that, it's kind of a weak song to go out on. Overall, Family Guy Live in Vegas is a fun little album that does perfectly capture what the show was at this point. And it was really fun getting to discover this extra piece of classic Family Guy media that I previously had no idea about. Following its post-cancellation success, Fox would order 35 brand new episodes of Family Guy in May of 2004, uncancelling the series for a second time. Despite the 3-year production hiatus, most of the show's creative team were able to return, which isn't all too common with situations like this. Most of the time, only a few key staff members are able to come back, with the rest of the old guard having to be replaced. Season 4 finally premiered in May of 2005 and was a massive ratings hit, giving the show its highest viewership since Season 1 and telling Fox they clearly made the right move. The season premiered with the episode North by North Quahog, where Peter and Lois attempt to go on a second honeymoon due to them feeling their marriage has lost its spark. Through wacky shenanigans, they end up in Mel Gibson's private hotel suite where Peter finds and steals a film reel for a Passion of the Christ sequel. This causes Mel Gibson to hunt them down and eventually take Lois, with Peter having to rescue her, ending on a big fight on top of Mount Rushmore where Peter and Lois rekindle their love. It's a great episode that feels like they haven't missed a beat in between seasons, with the episode being written by Seth MacFarlane. From there, the show tries to convince you that it's just business as usual, but after the first few episodes, you start picking up on some major changes to how the characters are presented, mainly with Peter and Stewie. At the start of the revival era, Peter had lost a lot of the animosity he had in seasons 1, 2, and 3. He's nowhere near as misogynistic and is actually far more supportive of Lois.
Oh, jeez, Carter, what are we doing?
I mean, if Lois wants to be a model, we don't got any right to stop her.
You really mean that, Peter?
Of course I do. I just want you to be happy.
These changes are also marked by a severe dip in his intelligence, where he has simultaneously become far more innocent, yet also progressively dangerous to himself and others until eventually he just becomes a menace to society. As for Stewie, the idea of the evil baby has pretty much fizzled out. I assumed it would be a more gradual change, but no, his plots of world domination just aren't a thing anymore. And now he's there to offer a witty remark and play off Brian, who have now become the show's primary comedic duo, with Peter and Brian's friendship hardly getting any focus aside from a handful of spotlight episodes. As for the rest of the family, they're mostly the same and have some fantastic episodes, though you are starting to see certain traits become exaggerated over time, which is where the real issue starts to form. Back in seasons 1 to 3, I talked about how one of the most charming qualities was that the Griffins as characters were very grounded, with lots of humour coming from how they reacted to the outlandish and unpredictable world around them. And while the world of Family Guy still has its eccentricities, it's become less wacky and chaotic, because most of that has been diverted to the Griffins. In a sense, the show no longer becomes about a mostly normal family dealing with a crazy world, it's now about a mostly normal world dealing with a crazy family. And over the next few seasons, the Griffins become increasingly more destructive and violent, which sullies a lot of that relatability that endeared people to them. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The season 2 episode, Death is a Bitch, sees Death come to take Peter after he lies about being deceased to get out of paying a hospital bill. Then Death hurts his ankle and has to stay at the Griffins, meaning no one on Earth can die, which Peter reveals. To instill the fear of death in people again, Death tasks Peter with killing the cast of Dawson's Creek.
Death, there is no way Peter can do your job. He could never kill anyone.
In the end, Peter realizes that he can't go through with it.
I don't care if you do kill me. I'm not gonna kill those kids.
And now we jump ahead a few seasons where Peter hardly bats an eye at people being killed and does it all the time, even when it's his own kids. And I really don't think I even have to discuss Peter's treatment of Meg in the later seasons, where he simply does not love her. And playing off his constant physical and emotional abuse of his daughter as funny was bad enough, but later seasons try and spin this into something positive and healthy. In a recent episode, Meg finds out the only thing she's good at is basketball, but only when she's being insulted by Peter. And Lois, despite being self-aware of how messed up this is, encourages it. It's basically a far worse version of wasted talent, and not even Meg getting a happy ending can save it. I wouldn't say the other characters went through a process of Flanderization per se, it was more that other pieces of their personalities began to fall away, simplifying them exponentially until there wasn't much left. Meg's defining joke becomes how quote-unquote ugly she is, Lois no longer teaches piano, and they've completely dropped the idea of Chris being an artist. With each season, they started feeling less like characters and more like vessels for jokes. And that is where we have to talk about Brian. By the end of the 2000s, Brian lacked any purpose or meaningful characterization outside of him and Stewie's dynamic. The original run saw Brian constantly trying to better himself, reconciling with his past and looking for ways to find fulfillment in his life. But by season 8, that's all gone. Brian is no longer in therapy, he isn't making any attempts to improve, he's simply become a more cynical version of Peter, jumping into any wild opportunity he comes across in the hopes it will solve his perpetual midlife crisis, which leaves him feeling bitter. And this isn't helped when the show starts devoting way too much time to his love life, which was only touched upon in 3 episodes of the original run. My guess is the writers realised they were getting bored of marriage conflicts, and Brian was the only adult character not in a relationship, so they started giving him all these stories about him being unlucky in love. Well, not exactly unlucky, more so he finds multiple women he connects with but messes it up because he is a bad person who hurts the people he cares about, and that is now what defines his character. In season 2, there was an episode called Brian in Love. It's the episode where Brian starts attending therapy and is about him realising that he is in love with Lois. It's a story about how guilty he feels for having feelings for his best friend's wife, and they deal with it in a mature way. Then you get to season 4 and onward, where they keep referencing how Brian is hopelessly in love with Lois, and it's mostly played for laughs. Throughout seasons 4 through 7, the show chips away at everything that made Brian such a likable and compelling character, and replaces it with obnoxious storylines where his pompous and hypocritical attitude is put on display. Now, Brian has always been conceited and would constantly brag about having the moral high ground. The difference is back then, there were other things to balance it out. Also, he's now extremely racist because apparently that's supposed to be funny. So far, I have been dragging the revival seasons through the mud. And yes, its characterization is very flawed, and the gap between seasons 3 and 4 is very noticeable. Especially when characters who used to appear often, like Joe's son Kevin or Cleveland Jr., drop off the face of the earth. But I still do really enjoy this middle era of the show. A lot of it is due to nostalgia, because when I started watching Family Guy, these were the most recent episodes and the ones constantly playing on TV. But there are still a boatload of really fantastic episodes from these years. Don't Make Me Over is one of the last really good Meg episodes. After Meg is made to feel ugly by kids at school, Lois takes her for a makeover to try and cheer her up. Meanwhile, Peter and the guys try and form a band, but when their first gig goes horribly wrong, the rest of the family jumps in to save him. Turns out, they actually make for a good band and immediately get signed. But the fame starts to change Meg until she gets a wake-up call in the form of Jimmy Fallon, which Peter takes care of. In PTV, Peter starts his own raunchy TV channel after the FCC starts aggressively censoring everything. When Peter doesn't back down at the threat of the organisation, they start censoring the entire family. It's one of the final times the show really has anything of value to say about a given topic, is full of classic moments, and of course the best song in the entire show that scored it yet another Emmy nomination. Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story is a straight-to-DVD movie that was later split into the final 3 episodes of season 4. Following a near-death experience, Stewie attempts to reform his ways, leading to him becoming an alcoholic, then travelling to San Francisco when he sees a man on TV he thinks is his real father, only for it to actually be him from the future. It's one of the most creative and ambitious outings, with a fun look into the future of the characters that also serves as a great deconstruction of who Stewie was in this era. I also love the beginning and ending segments exclusive to the DVD, where the characters all attend a big red carpet premiere and talk about returning after being cancelled, which features a bunch of callbacks to episodes from the original run. Season 5's No Chris Left Behind sees Chris being expelled from school for being the dumbest student. Lois asks her father to get Chris into a fancy boarding school, but he is targeted by the rest of the students because he's not from a wealthy family. To fix this, Lois's dad inducts Chris into a secret society, but when Chris learns his family all got second jobs to pay for his tuition, he gives it all up and asks Carter to get him back into his old school. It's an all-around great Chris episode that features the longest and most creative of the Peter and the giant chicken fights. Meet the Quagmires is the season 5 finale and has Peter ask Death to take him back in time to when he was single for one night. His partying causes him to miss an important date with Lois, leading to a butterfly effect where Lois is married to Quagmire. Now Peter and Brian have to go back in time to fix the past. It's a wonderful Back to the Future homage that calls back to one of my favourite episodes pre-cancellation, and one of the final times they really made you care about Peter and Lois's marriage, to a point where had the show ended here, I honestly don't think I could complain. And those aren't the only standouts. All the way through season 7, they were still turning out consistently funny episodes, a lot of them surpassing those first 3 seasons. This was an era where the show was always being inventive with its storylines and wasn't afraid of making significant changes to the status quo, such as Chris entering high school or Peter getting a permanent new job. The show started doing sequel episodes and in general had a much stronger sense of continuity. The animation was still quite expressive and at times really damn good. The real problem is between 2005 and 2008, we slowly witnessed the show lose its soul. The Griffins rarely expressed genuine love for each other that wasn't undermined by some kind of punchline, as the show became adverse to any moments of genuine emotion between the characters. The season 7 episode, Baby Not On Board, is a really good story about Stewie accidentally accidentally getting left behind when the family goes on a vacation. While Stewie deals with the joys and challenges of being independent and eventually starts to miss his family, everyone else tries to get back home, but Peter keeps making things worse until Lois blows up at him. Now, in the older seasons, this would likely lead to a moment of self-reflection where Peter understands he's messed up and tries to do the right thing. Instead of that, though, he just quotes planes, trains, and automobiles because...
Movie references.
And therein lies the true problem here, because Family Guy did not get bad after it returned. It got careless. It stopped giving a damn about how these characters are supposed to act. Around season 8 and 9, Seth MacFarlane greatly stepped back from the show as a creative force so he could move on to other projects, voicing his characters but not really being involved with the writing. In fact, MacFarlane wanted to end the show back in 2011, but it was still going strong in the ratings, so that wasn't going to happen. And it was season 9 where I felt the show really fell off the deep end. Maybe it's nostalgia, but I really do think the show switching to widescreen is when it becomes near unwatchable, because outside of the Brian and Stewie episodes, there just seems to be this lack of passion. This is also where the visuals took a nosedive as the animation became far more limited and sterile. And one thing that was very disappointing for me is how the music got so heavily scaled back. The series' original musical numbers were one of its biggest selling points, yet after season 9, they become such a rarity. The show was occasionally still funny, but that was it. It was just funny. The show had nothing of substance to say about its characters or life. It was just going through the motions, constantly pushing the limits of what they could get away with to stay relevant. The intelligent, subversive writing that even at its dumbest always had a certain level of wit to it was replaced by excessive gory violence and storylines that were meant to be purposefully unsatisfying, all to keep people talking about the show because that's the only way it can survive. And I'm not blaming the writers or saying that they did this on purpose. Animation is a business, and finding a reliable and consistent job is rare. If you can land a gig on a long-running show like Family Guy or The Simpsons, it gives them some type of security. By season 11, I had pretty much checked out. I've heard good things about the most recent seasons, and even a few clips I've seen have me curious about checking out some of their latest stuff, because it seems like they're at least trying to make Meg and Lois interesting and likable again to an extent. But it still simply isn't Family Guy to me, because even when the show has any sort of tender moment between the characters, it doesn't feel genuine. I guess after a decade of watching the Griffins deteriorate, becoming more violent and awful towards one another, I can't buy anything the show tries to pass off as sincere anymore. I commend the people trying to reignite that creative spark, but I feel at this point the damage has been long done. And throughout the new episodes, if you take a look in the backgrounds, you'll occasionally catch a brief glimpse of the characters as they once were, even as people's memories of them continue to fade. Do you want to know what made me want to do this video? At Christmas I went home and at one point my dad put on a new episode. He'd been watching Family Guy from its early years. I even remember catching brief glimpses of it on the TV when I was very young and being confused why I wasn't allowed to watch a cartoon. Then when I was old enough, we started watching it together. Now about halfway through this modern episode, he turned to me and said, "I swear this used to be funnier." So we stopped watching it, and I decided to then put on the season 3 Christmas episode, and it was night and day. That's when I knew I wanted to revisit the first decade of the show and really look at how it evolved and devolved season to season. Because at the end of the day, I still really love this show despite its many faults. Even today, despite how unlikely it is, I still hold an ember of hope that Seth will end up making that long stuck in development hell movie, and I'll get to see these characters as I remember them one final time. So there you have it, my long inane ramblings about the world of animation's biggest punching bag, and what was, and in some ways still is, one of my favourite animated shows ever written. Because at its best, Family Guy was lightning in a bottle, A hodgepodge of comedic styles packaged into a subversive yet still well-meaning show. And even in its more wild moments, it still felt grounded and took its characters and stories seriously. And that's how I'm going to keep remembering Family Guy. Not as a compilation of out-of-context funny moments or the occasional viral clip that reminds people that it still exists. Until next time, I've been the Gladding Gladiator, and... A huge thank you to the Beautiful Souls, the Wacky Delis, Zombie Rex, Torai Matson, Restblade Nova, Oliver's Reviews and Shows, Blast6, Britt Vaughn, Tomb for Fort, Tom Pat, and Joseph Balash for supporting me over on Patreon. If you like what I do and want to help support the future of the channel, as well as get access to a ton of fun perks, the best way to do that is by becoming a Patreon. But of course, it's entirely optional, and simply viewing the stuff I put out there means so much to me. Thanks so much for watching, folks, and I'll see ya real soon.